The record-breaking housing price rises that preceded the record-breaking housing market collapse were not evenly spread across the United States, but were heavily concentrated in a relatively few places. Much confusion between local trends and national trends in housing markets contributed to counterproductive government policies. We need to understand what led to both kinds of home price trends during the boom before examining the causes and consequences of the housing bust and the repercussions that spread, not only across the nation, but internationally. The cast of characters. In order to follow the story of the housing boom and bust more easily, it may be worth pausing to briefly note the main cast of characters in the housing markets. While the individual home buyer may deal solely with a bank that provides the money to buy the house, in exchange for a mortgage to be paid off in monthly installments, behind that bank and over that bank are all sorts of other institutions whose actions affect or control the housing markets. The Federal Reserve System has a general authority to regulate banks across the country, as well as specific powers to take actions which affect interest rates and the money supply. Given the great importance of the level of interest rates in the home mortgage markets, the Federal Reserve is a major player in that market, even though that is just one of the markets in which its influence is felt. The Federal National Mortgage Association, Fannie Mae, and the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, Freddie Mac, are two government-created but privately owned profit-making enterprises that buy mortgages from banks. By selling these mortgages, banks get money from a 30-year mortgage without having to wait 30 years for monthly payments from home buyers to pay off their debts. With the proceeds from these sales to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or to other financial institutions, the banks then have money to lend again to create more mortgages from which to profit. More than 2/3 of the mortgages made in 2004, for example, were resold to some other financial institution, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These two government-sponsored enterprises bought more than 1/3 of all the mortgages in the nation that were resold by the original lenders. In order to qualify to sell their mortgages to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, banks must conform to the rules and standards prescribed by these mortgage market giants, including rules and standards that banks must in turn apply to people who seek loans to buy houses. One of the consequences, however, of reselling mortgages on a large scale is that the initial lender has fewer incentives to be meticulous about the financial qualifications of the people to whom mortgage loans are made. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, is another major institution in the housing market. HUD exercises authority over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and therefore indirectly over banks and home buyers, as well as directly influencing mortgage lending practices. Other important players, and relatively new players in recent years, are Wall Street firms which buy mortgages, bundle them together, and issue stocks and bonds based on the value of those mortgages. Wall Street firms have sold these bundles to investors across the country and around the world. Although a California home buyer might borrow the money from a local bank to buy a house, the ultimate source of that money might be in New York or London or Tokyo. These and other organizations affecting the housing market are very different from one another and are responsible to very different constituencies. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, is a cabinet-level agency responsible to whatever administration is in power in Washington. Although the Federal Reserve System is also a government agency, it is led by a board whose members' staggered terms in office overlap different administrations in order to make them independent of any particular administration. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are responsible to their stockholders, as Wall Street firms are. But Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are also what are called government-sponsored enterprises, meaning that they were created by the federal government, which has some continuing involvement in their policies. More important, that government involvement leads other financial institutions to lend to these two hybrid institutions at lower interest rates than they would to completely private enterprises because of the implicit assumption that, in the event of a crisis, the federal government would not let Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac fail. Investors buy securities issued by